A courtroom turned silent. The story of a boy who spoke up. Isaiah, a quiet 14-year-old black boy, always took the seat in the farthest corner of Mrs. Emerson's classroom. Each morning, he slipped in with downcast eyes, his presence as faint as a whisper. Mrs. Emerson couldn't help but notice the sadness in his demeanor. His long sleeves barely concealed the faint bruises on his arms, and when asked about them, he shrugged off her concerns with a tired, "I'm fine." Isaiah lived with his foster parents, Paul and Marcy, who were prominent figures in the town, known for hosting charity galas and always wearing bright smiles. They were adored by neighbors and revered in church as saints who opened their home to a boy in need. But Mrs. Emerson's instincts told her otherwise. Isaiah carried a heaviness that no cheerful exterior could mask. One afternoon, after class, Mrs. Emerson asked Isaiah to stay behind. She spoke gently. "Isaiah, I'm worried about you. Are you safe at home?" His eyes briefly welled up, but he quickly shook his head and muttered, "I'm fine," before hurrying away. It wasn't the first time she'd seen such guarded responses. It wasn't the first time her gut told her that something was terribly wrong. The following day, Mrs. Emerson noticed fresh bruises on Isaiah's wrists. When she lightly touched his arm in concern, he flinched. That was the moment she decided she couldn't remain silent. After school, she contacted Child Protective Services, CPS. The mask cracks. CPS sent an investigator to Paul and Marcy's home. As expected, they presented a picture-perfect household, a spotless living room, laughter ringing in the air, and a well-rehearsed narrative about a clumsy teenager. Isaiah remained silent, staring at the carpet as Paul and Marcy assured the investigator that everything was fine. There wasn't enough evidence to act, and Isaiah's hesitant, "I just fell," sealed the case for now. But Mrs. Emerson wasn't ready to give up. She began documenting every bruise, every whispered remark from classmates who had overheard Paul berating Isaiah outside the school. Her notes painted a pattern of neglect and possible abuse. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Paul and Marcy grew bolder. They punished Isaiah for being ungrateful, sometimes locking him in his room without dinner. Isaiah endured the torment in silence, convinced no one would believe a foster child over two beloved community figures. The final straw. One afternoon, Isaiah limped into class, his red-rimmed eyes betraying the pain he tried to hide. Mrs. Emerson's heart broke. She stormed into the principal's office, demanding a deeper investigation. This time, armed with her detailed records and testimony from two classmates. A new social worker reopened the case. Paul and Marcy were furious. They accused Mrs. Emerson of overstepping and threatened to pull Isaiah out of the school. But the district intervened, halting any drastic actions until the investigation concluded. Everything changed when a neighbor provided a recording of Paul shouting at Isaiah. The audio captured the venom in Paul's words and Isaiah's tearful pleas, combined with Mrs. Emerson's evidence. The case escalated to an emergency court hearing, a courtroom of truth. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the hearing began. Paul and Marcy arrived in crisp suits, their expressions a mix of indignation and false humility. Isaiah sat next to Mrs. Emerson, clutching the bench, his small frame trembling. Judge Evelyn Carter, known for her no-nonsense approach, presided over the case. She meticulously reviewed the evidence, bruises, teacher logs, and the damning audio. Paul's defense attorney wasted no time painting the couple as dedicated foster parents enforcing strict discipline to guide a troubled boy. Isaiah was called to the stand. His heart raced as he slid into the witness box. Paul's piercing glare froze him in place. A silent warning. Isaiah's throat felt tight as the attorney barraged him with questions, suggesting he was simply clumsy or exaggerating. Judge Carter raised a hand, signaling the lawyer to ease off. Her voice softened as she addressed Isaiah. "Are you safe at home, Isaiah?" The boy hesitated, his gaze fixed on the scuffed wood of the witness box. Memories of Mrs. Emerson's support, the neighbor's recording, and the fear he carried every day flooded his mind. A voice deep within urged him, "Speak." With a trembling breath, he finally said it, "It's not safe." 2 words. The courtroom stilled. Judge Carter's face turned pale. Her shock evident, she leaned forward, her voice urgent but kind. Isaiah, can you explain what you mean by not safe? Through tears, Isaiah spoke. They hurt me. They say I'm worthless. They said if I talked, they'd make it worse. Each word felt like a weight lifted, but it took all his strength to utter them. Paul's lawyer objected, claiming the judge was leading the child. Judge Carter silenced him with a firm glare. The courtroom grew even quieter as the neighbor's recording played. The harsh words and Isaiah's broken sobs echoed through the room. Gasps rippled through the audience. When the audio ended, Judge Carter turned back to Isaiah. "Thank you for your courage," she said softly. "This court will ensure you are protected." A turning point. Paul and Marcy's masks crumbled. Paul erupted, pointing a shaking finger at Mrs. Emerson. "You did this. You turned him against us," he shouted. Marcy dissolved into tears, claiming they only wanted to help Isaiah. Judge Carter's gavel struck. "Silence," she commanded. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, the evidence is clear. Isaiah will be removed from your care immediately. Charges of neglect and emotional abuse will follow." Isaiah's tears flowed freely as relief washed over him. Mrs. Emerson placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You did it." A new beginning. Outside the courtroom, reporters clamored for answers. Mrs. Emerson shielded Isaiah as they slipped through a side exit. In the days that followed, the town reeled from the revelations. Paul and Marcy's carefully constructed image was shattered. Isaiah was placed with a new foster family, the Wilsons, who specialized in helping children who had endured trauma. Their home was warm and inviting, and they offered Isaiah stability, therapy, and patience. When Mrs. Emerson visited a week later, she found him in a sunny bedroom painted a calming blue. He greeted her with a shy smile and showed her a new sketch, vibrant and full of life. "I joined the art club," he said proudly. "You deserve this, Isaiah," Mrs. Emerson said. "Your bravery made it possible." A legacy of courage. Back at school, Isaiah sat closer to the front, his shoulders no longer hunched. His story inspired other students to share their struggles, and the counselor's office became a refuge for those seeking help. One afternoon, Isaiah approached Mrs. Emerson's desk. "Thank you for never giving up on me," he said quietly. "If you hadn't, I'd still be there." Mrs. Emerson's throat tightened. "That's what teachers do," she replied. "But you found your voice. You made a difference." Isaiah smiled. "And I made a judge go pale," he added with a small laugh. Mrs. Emerson chuckled. "You certainly did." Isaiah's story, a boy who spoke two words that shook a courtroom, became a reminder that even in silence, courage can find its voice, changing everything in a single moment.